This is the first program in a series about what I consider the most important thing in your life, your language. In just a moment, we're going to show you what language really is and how the words you use and how you have to use them actually affect the way you think and even the way you see the world. Yes, this is a series about language. And on this series, we're going to examine language. We're going to see what it is and what it isn't. We're going to see how it structures, how it patterns. We're going to see how language relates to writing. We're going to see something about how language varies and how it changes. We're going to talk about correctness and about grammar. We're going to do some detective work and find out where our language came from and how it relates to other languages. And we're going to see how the scientific study of language, linguistics, actually can be applied to very practical problems, such as learning a foreign language, teaching children how to read, and even at the end, the evaluation of the psychiatric interview. Now, in this very first program, I want to start off talking to you about some misconceptions that every educated person, or nearly every educated person, has about language. I want to show you how terribly important language is, and I want to show you that language is just not a series of words strung together. And this business about the misconception about language and words, probably the most important one is this conviction that so many of us have, that words have meaning, that every word has or should have one unalterable and unchanging meaning. Well, this is just not so. As we're going to see, words never have just one meaning ever. I think this thing was really very well brought home to many of us when some time ago the President of the United States himself used a word when he was talking about some Russian propaganda that had come out of the Kremlin, and he used the word gimmick. And this particular word, gimmick, caused a lot of attention. What did the president mean by gimmick? It actually got all over the newspapers and in newspaper headlines. Here, for instance, the Herald Tribune says, President Brand's nuclear test halt a red gimmick. And people wanted to know, what did this word mean? What was the meaning of this word gimmick? And there were editorials, as I say, and all kinds of newspaper comment, and people wondered, and they thought that it must have one meaning and all the rest of it. So we decided we wanted to find out what gimmick meant to people too. So we took a film crew, and we went right out on the street, right outside of this building, and we asked several people what gimmick meant to them. And this is what we got.
A gimmick? Well, I think a gimmick is a trick used perhaps by people in the advertising field, such as a contest to gain people's interest in a certain product.
Well, it's to me a gimmick is a little object which is not too important. It's sort of like a small invention.
Could I give an example? For instance, Frank Sinatra doesn't use gimmicks when he sings, and some others use gimmicks.
Let's see, a gimmick is a means of convincing someone of something or some idea that is not really true.
So there you have it. 4 different people and 4 different meanings for the word gimmick. And this is the way it was all over the country. And people are concerned. You see, they feel that this word has got to have just one meaning. Well, gimmick is just like every other word in the language. It never has just one meaning, ever. All words are like gimmick in this respect. And you might say, oh, no, look, that's unfair, because really, I mean, gimmick is a very special kind of word. I mean, gimmick is a word like thingamabob, you know. It's one of those kinds of words in the language that are obviously in the language, just so they can have sort of loose meaning. It's not a real word like table. Now, a word like table, you see, that really refers to just one thing, a table. But does the word table always refer to just one thing? For instance, when I use the word table to refer to this table, is it the same word and does it mean the same thing as that dictionary table over there? And how about a thing like the water table? Is the water table a table with water on it? No. It's how far the surface, below the surface of the earth the water is. And how about logarithm table? Obviously, table and logarithm table isn't the same kind of table as this table. No, so you see, really, even the words that we think of as being obviously words that only have one good, fine, unalterable, concrete meaning, they don't. A word like table, in this respect, is just exactly like a word like gimmick. Table and gimmick are the same in this regard. Now, this business of words never having one meaning. Again, the words in a language, even in the same society, people of the same kind of educational background and so on, different words have different areas of meaning coverage for them. For instance, take color words. Now, men in our culture get along pretty well with a half a dozen color words like red, blue, green, yellow, and so on. Of course, men that have to concern themselves with color professionally, like color chemists and artists, have more words, more color words. And women always have more color words than the ordinary man in our culture. I can remember some years ago my wife had a very pretty dress, and I always called it to myself her green dress. So one night she said to me, "Honey, what dress shall I wear tonight?" And I said, "Wear your green dress." And she looked at me kind of amazed, and she said, "You know I don't have a stitch of green to my name. I look simply livid in green. Which one do you mean?" I said, "I mean the one that buttons up the back." She said, "Oh, you mean my aqua dress. I've told you 100 times that's aqua." Well, my wife can not only tell the difference between aqua and green, she can tell the difference between aqua and turquoise, and this is something, believe me, I can never do. So in other words, she has different color words to talk about, different color impressions that she happens to have. These particular words cover different referent areas for her and for me, men and women in the same culture. Now, I would say that probably she sees the world of color differently than I do, and she has, partly by virtue of the fact that she has these different color words. Now, it's not only within one language and within one culture that we find such a thing as color words being different and making perhaps people see the world differently through different color words. Let's examine for a minute the whole matter of the spectrum. Now, in our particular language, in our particular culture, we break up what we call the spectrum with 6 color terms: purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Now, these 6 color terms do the job very well for us, and as far as we're concerned, that's the way the spectrum is. This is the normal and natural way. But do all languages use 6 color terms for these same impressions of the physical world coming in to physiologically normal people? No. For instance, a language in western Nigeria called Shona has only 3 color terms. This term, chipsuka, here you see, and here covers purple and orange and red, that whole area. Whereas Chitema and Chikena split the blue, green, yellow business between them. And there's another language in western Nigeria, Bassa. And Bassa has only 2 color terms, Hui and Zizan. And you might say, well, this seems incredible. These people must be colorblind. How can they get along with only 2 color terms? Can't they tell the difference between the color of the grass and the color of the sky? Well, if you ask them, they'd say, sure. That's sky Hui and that's grass Hui. In other words, they get along perfectly well. They get the same kinds of impressions generally, physically, that we do, but having different words. I'm quite sure they see the world of experience differently than we do because it is filtering to them through different words. Words now that are, where there are only 2 words, where we have 6. At least I'm sure it's this way in terms of this turquoise, green, blue business between me and my wife. I know she sees the world of color differently from the way I do. So you can see then that words never have one meaning, and that words themselves, in the same society, in the same language, and in different languages, split the world of experience in terms of different color reference. Now, in the way in which languages work in this way, that is, in the way in which words get assigned, so to speak, to the world of experience, that is, how words symbolize the real world around us, this is always an arbitrary or a customary matter. In other words, people just, I'll put it this way, there is no really necessary connection in the world of reality, in the world of experience, that makes us call certain things, or makes us refer to certain things in the world of experience by certain words. You might say, oh no, this is not true in the case of onomatopoetic words, those words that represent real sounds in the world of experience, and are that way because they mirror a real sound. Well, I wonder if this is true. Anyhow, let's conduct a little experiment. Now, what was that sound? That was obviously a crack, wasn't it? I cracked it over my knee. Listen to it again. That's a crack, isn't it? Couldn't be anything else. That's that sound, and we call it a crack because that's the sound it makes, the real sound in the world of experience. Well, if this were true, and that there was a real and had to be a real connection between that sound and the word we use, then every language in the world ought to have the word crack in its vocabulary to tie up with that sound. Well, to test this out, we went to speakers of several different languages, and we put it up to them this way. We actually broke a board over our knee, and we said, what is that word? And this is what they said.
In Chinese, it would be kta. In Russian, it would be трещать. In Urdu, it would be cut.
In Korean, it would be tak.
In Polish, it would be krusz.
Well, you see, it isn't absolutely obvious and logical that this is crack. These people, not one of them, said anything that really sounded very much like crack at all. Well, in our very next program, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail. We're going to do this kind of experiment again and talk more about the arbitrary nature of language and the way in which language symbolizes the world of experience. So we see then, words don't have just one meaning ever, and that there is absolutely no real necessary connection in the world of reality, the world we see around us, and the words we use to describe it. Now, so far, what we've been talking about, really, has been words sort of pulled out of isolation, certain kinds of words, and we've been examining this business of the shaky business of words and their meaning. But we will find also that words can play other kinds of tricks on us. When we get words, for instance, that are paired off against one another, whole classes of words that seem to split the world of reality down the middle. Our languages, our familiar European languages, of which English, of course, is a member, go in for this kind of splitting a great deal. For instance, we have a whole series of words like good and bad and right and wrong, which seem to split the world. These are polar opposites. It seems impossible for us to actually have a word that could go between, that could split the difference between these. And because words like good and bad and right and wrong are, so to speak, at the top of this splitting list, it makes a whole series of moral judgments. A whole lot of words get pulled in to this particular classification, and we react to them in terms of what I would call a moral judgment. At least this is a theory and one that we're working on. Now notice, good, bad, right, wrong, moral, immoral. Can you possibly think of a word between moral and immoral, one that would split the difference? Well, if you thought of amoral, immediately you'd find that it would be attracted over here. An amoral person is at least childish. He hasn't yet grown up or become mature enough to know the real difference between right and wrong. And have you noticed that in our courts of law, we either plead guilty or not guilty? In other words, a person, unless he can be proved by due process of law to be guilty, has to be regarded as though he were innocent. In many cultures, it isn't a question of are you guilty or not guilty. It's a question of how guilty are you. In other words, other languages are not using these particular kinds of dichotomies and aren't seeing the world through this kind of splitting down the middle. For instance, let's take a few others to see if our theory bears out at all. Take a word like work. Now, obviously, a word like work is a very, very good word indeed. This is something highly prized in our culture. What's the opposite of work? Play, you'd say. Well, play is for children. But take a word like leisure. Leisure has no opposite but work. And it comes right over there. And don't you think perhaps that maybe we don't prize leisure quite as highly as we think? Satan always finds some work for idle hands to do, right? All right, now we can take a couple of other examples. For instance, there's one word that's interested me for years, and that word is the word theoretical. I've often wondered what Americans think the opposite of theoretical is. So we went out again with our film crew, and we asked some people what the opposite of theoretical was. And this is what we got.
I would say that theoretical was the opposite of practical. A practical reason for a thing is something that we can use in our everyday life. Theoretical, perhaps, is a thing that we know to be true, but is not the thing we can use every day.
Theoretical, well, that's the opposite of practical to me. And I like to do things with my hands, and I'd much rather do things than to think about them. So that a practical approach rather than a theoretical approach is much more appealing to me. I understand it better than the theoretical approach.
So the opposite of theoretical is practical. And practical is obviously on this side. And again, a word like research. I asked an American just the other day, what's the opposite of research? Research's opposite is production, without a question. In other words, I wonder then how we think about those people who are concerned in research, theoretical matters. I think we're probably of two minds about them, which might explain a lot of newspaper headlines we have today. Now, do all languages work like this? No. Chinese, for instance, doesn't. Chinese has a word, hao, which we translate good. But if you should ask a Chinese gentleman, if you met him on the street, chen cheng hao, if you said that to him, it would mean honored one, firstborn person, are things good with you? His answer would be hao. But does hao really mean good, right, moral, innocent? No, it means for the shape I'm in, I should complain. And if he should answer you bu hao, which we would translate bad, would it mean things are bad? No, it means for the shape I'm in, I shouldn't complain. But since you asked me just this once, I'll tell you, though I know things have been like this for 2,000 years in the past and will be like this for 2,000 years in the future. In other words, what it means is that we really can't translate the Chinese word into English, nor can English words be translated in this regard into Chinese. And that may be one of the reasons why we're having difficulty with the Chinese right now in international relations. So what I've been doing for the first half of this program is to be talking to you about words. And I've tried to show you that words can get us into trouble, that words themselves are not language, and that words themselves don't do the whole job. If words then, if language is more than words, what makes words operate? Well, words operate in language because language is pattern. And the thing that makes words work are patterns. That is what does the job. And this whole magnificent, amazing business of patterning, from the smallest sounds into words and up through the whole thing, that's what we're going to be talking about on this series of programs. Now, to show you how words can operate through patterns, let me show you something here. Let's take a word and pull it right out of pattern, right out of language. Toes. Now, you will say, obviously, that word doesn't mean anything. Well, let me show you how, if we put it back into pattern, we can get it to do some work for us. We can see that it can get meaning. Now, here it is. Now, notice, this is, of course, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which I've loved for years, and I've always said it this way, and I'm going to read it for you now. I don't know how you perhaps said it, but I've said, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the bora groves and the mulmerads out great." Right away now, I know, having this in pattern, that toves are more than one here, that slithy toves are obviously toves that are slippery and slimy, and that toes can gyre and gimble and wear better but in the wabe, a very natural place for them to gyre and gimble. And brillig obviously refers to a time of day or condition of the atmosphere where it's particularly appropriate for slithy toes to do their gyre and gimbling in the wabe. I have actually given it, then, meaning. I have given this word toves meaning and several other words because it has been put into patterns, grammatical patterns as we call them, and distributional patterns. This whole business of patterning, only man has been able to actually invent language. Language is man's alone, his first and greatest human invention. No other form of animal life can talk. And this business of patterning only is man's possession. And again, patterning in language is what we're going to be talking about on this series of programs. Now, these kinds of patterns, these distributional patterns and grammatical patterns, let me say something for just a moment about grammatical patterns, for instance. Now, here is the grammatical pattern, the favored sentence type of a language like English, the actor-action-result sentence type, the subject, verb, and complement we all learned about in school. This kind of pattern, along with the fact that the verb must be put along a timeline, past, non-past, or present and future. This pattern allows words to work for us, allows us to talk about the world of experience. For instance, we can say, I went to Paris. Mr. Jones went to Paris. But we also have to say, the road went to Paris, when we know perfectly well that roads don't get up and go anywhere and nobody takes them anywhere. So obviously, then, these kinds of grammatical patterns, which are obligatory, are straitjackets on us, allow us to talk, allow the words to work for us. But at times, because the pattern is obligatory, sometimes we put words into the slot and begin to react to them as though they were alive. For instance, because the actors generally could do something. Communism is stalking across the face of Asia. Obviously, communism doesn't do anything like stalking, but when we talk about it that way, maybe sometime we actually think about communism as though we could come to grips with it, as though it were alive. Well, it isn't. So these particular kinds of grammatical patterns allow words to work for us. What I'm going to do now is, and what I've been doing, is just giving you a very brief survey of patterns. I'd like to show you now, if I could, another pattern, what we call the intonation pattern. In other words, we've talked very briefly about grammatical patterns, about distributional patterns. Now the intonation pattern is composed of pitches of the voice, shown here by numbers, and ways in which we end stretches of utterance, shown here by the single bar mark, which squeezes the pitch, this one here, which allows the voice to trail off into silence, and this one here, which represents the voice rising. Now these particular numbers I can now read because they are a clue to which significant pitch level is used. Now listen, he has a very pleasant personality. When I keep it up at pitch 2, 1 is the lowest and 4 is the highest pitch, and let it trail off into silence, I have now said the only thing this person has to recommend him is a sort of speciousness of personality. Now, if I say it this way, he has a very pleasant personality, and allow my voice to rise slightly there. He has a very pleasant personality. You hear that? That means now we would expect, but I don't like the way he parts his hair, I don't like the way he talks to his wife at the bridge table. Now if I say he has a very pleasant personality, come all the way down to pitch 1 and go off into silence, I've made a compliment, or made a complimentary statement in our culture. In other words, same distribution patterns, same grammatical patterns, but different intonation patterns. Gives me 3 entirely different meanings, and yet there's only one little piece of structure different in each one of these cases. In other words, patterns. Patterns are the things that do the job for us. Now, this business of patterning, this extremely important business of patterning, and I've just given you some very rapidly, some examples. We've mentioned distributional, grammatical patterns, now intonation patterns. But I want you to realize this, that this very quick survey of patterning, which is what we're going to be doing on this series of programs, that language itself, this amazing system of patterning, which is only the possession of human beings, language itself is not the only kind of pattern system that goes on in communication. That is communication now, meaning how people really interact with each other. Obviously, language is the principal mode of communicating, of interacting. But there are other things that go on, other patterns that are patterned in of themselves and patterned with language. Paralanguage, tone of voice phenomena over and above language. And kinesics. Kinesics, the structured and patterned use of bodily motion in communication. Now what we have to realize is this. We can actually not talk at all. That is, language can never be used for any appreciable length without paralanguage and kinesics at the same time. In other words, if you listen to me now, as you have been, you've heard my voice go up and down. You've heard, for instance, that particular over-loudness that I used just then for emphasis. That kind of thing is part of paralanguage, what we call over-loudness, and it can be measured in degrees and seen to pattern. I can also go over soft, and that can be used for emphasis, too. And notice, as I'm talking, notice how my knees went down and my finger came out. I can't possibly talk without both paralanguage and kinesics. For instance, take kinesics for just a second. If I want to be sure you're listening to me, I can say something like this. Do you understand me? Do you really understand me? And you will notice that my head goes down. I'm digging you, so to speak. My eyebrows wrinkle and my eyelids blink up and down. I can't possibly speak a sentence, certain kinds of sentences, without a kinesic marker. For instance, just a simple sentence like this one. Suppose I wanted to say to you something like this. John gave Bill money. Did you notice what I did with my head? John gave Bill money. Did you see my head go over there on money? I've got to give a signal with my body when I get to that particular word. I've got, John gave Bill money. If it's not my head, it's going to be my thumb or some part of my body. John gave Bill money. Head can go on that side. But I have to use part of this other patterning along with language in order to really talk. Again, paralanguage, all kinds of things can happen here, and we know what they are. We know how to structure them. Let me give you an example. We call the vocal characterizer of breaking of the voice. For instance, if I say, yeah, I suppose so. Now this nervous giggle obviously signals that I'm not quite secure in what I'm saying. If I use, for instance, that breaking in another context, and as I lay down my burden to those younger and stronger than I, there's a politician. That breaking is supposed to give you an idea of how emotionally he's involved in what he's saying. Now, when all of these things fit together, they are what we call congruent. In other words, when paralanguage and when language and when kinesics all pattern together in an expected way, then communication goes on with relatively little disturbance. In other words, if I should see you in the morning, I should say, how are you this morning? With a smile like that, and that kind of kinesics, that's congruent. But if I should say, how are you this morning? With that kind of paralanguage and that kind of kinesics, that's not congruent. Now, the whole business of checking congruence and incongruence has actually allowed us to see, since we can symbolize this business now, actually allowed us to see what really goes on in communication. And this is being used now to help people understand what goes on in the psychotherapeutic interview. Linguists and kinesiologists are now helping psychiatrists really evaluate the psychotherapeutic interview. Now, in our 13th program, we're actually going to go in to that particular aspect of communication. But what we're going to do now is to not concern ourselves with paralanguage and kinesics until, again, the 13th program, but with language. In other words, it is the patterning of language, and what language is and what it isn't, which is our principal concern on this program. Now, to summarize for you what we have done today, we have been, of course, extremely rapid. And I have had to go very, very rapidly over a very vast subject. But I have tried to, even at the very beginning, talk about certain misconceptions that people have. And the primary misconception that we've been talking about is that language is more than words, and that words themselves do not have one unalterable and unchanging meaning. That the thing that makes words do their work for us is actually the patterns of language, and that the patterns of language are of varying kinds, and that we can now analyze these patterns and we can actually see the structure of language. Now, it's going to be that mainly the one theme that is going to go through our whole series of programs will be the series of patterning. And we will see from the very minutest kind of sound patterning to see how the words are built and how those words fit into larger contexts. And as I said, we're also going to do a considerable amount of showing you what language is in terms of defining language and its actual role. Actually, how people are able to talk by using words in patterns and see exactly what the structure of language is. And then we're going to see how the application of this particular knowledge of structure can be applied to really practical problems. Now, in our program next week, what we're going to do is to begin a definition of language. This particular definition of language we're going to carry through 2 or 3 programs, because we're going to try to show you that language is not what you thought it is, or might have thought it is. We're going to try to show you again, along with this, what language is not. We're going to try to show you, particularly next week, the difference between language and writing. This particular confusion is probably the greatest confusion there is, outside of the idea that words have meaning. So for next week, then, we will be talking particularly about language and writing, and about this matter of language and logic. Is there any necessary connection in the world of reality? And how is language related to logic? So for next week, then, for language and writing, and language and logic, be with us then, won't you?
This is National Educational Television.